What's up, guys? Welcome back. Today I want to show you how to assemble your brand new aftermarket pistons, go over rod orientation with piston orientation, and I also want to go over just installing the rings and showing you the ring gaps and all that. So it's pretty simple. Let's hop into it.
I got what you want, plus I got what you need. Smoking on the finest strain, hustle from a different breed. Every day we risk it all just to rise to the top. Tony Montana motivation, so we never gon' stop. I'm on my Cleveland hustle. I'm on my Cleveland hustle.
Alrighty, so to start out, you're gonna have your rods in the box when they come in. Some are stamped, and these are specific to the caps that they come with, so you can't mix and match these caps. They're machined to fit the rod they were attached to when you got them in the box, and they typically come with like their ARP hardware. So these ones just come off like that, and make sure when you're using ARP hardware you have the proper socket for the head. So this is a 12-point head, and you don't want to use something different because you could risk stripping the head off the bolt, and it's going to be a pain in the ass to get out. So you don't want to do that. Also, these bolts have a little indent on the top and on the bottom, and that's so you can use a caliper and you could measure the rod stretch if you're doing that method. So what you want to do, even though these are brand new, and actually I already put these rod bearings in here, just take these out. The rod bearings will come in a separate package, but you should know the bottom or the back will say L, that's lower shell, and it has a tang. Also, aftermarket bearings will have a bevel for the big chamfer side to match the big chamfer side on the rod caps. Same deal on this one. This is going to be a U stamped on the back, which stands for upper shell, and upper goes to the actual rods. So kind of picture it, upper meaning when the engine's in the correct orientation, standing up straight. So that's why they mark it like that. And then basically the tangs will go on the same side when you assemble these. So don't have the two tangs on opposites like this. You'd want to make sure those tangs are both on the same side. On the same side there. So if you see that, you see that both those tangs are on the same side, and on this side there's no tang. So that's something to take into account. Next thing, like I just kind of discussed, aftermarket rods, they will have this big chamfer, and that goes to the large radius on the crankshaft. You're going to have basically your rod. There's going to be 2 rods per journal on an LS engine, and one side is going to be flat, like this one. You can see that's kind of more of a flat, there's no real radius, and this side has the chamfer. There's a big chamfer on that side. So the 2 flat sides will basically ride against each other with about 20 thousandths of side rod clearance in between there. And that's why that's like that. So you want to make sure that you get the orientation of the chamfer correct, or else you'll get what's called crank ride, and it'll kill that fillet, and it'll seize up your engine and ruin your whole entire rotating assembly. So that's something you definitely got to pay attention to. Okay, so that does matter. So we got bearings, rod assembly. Taking apart the rod for the first time out of the box, they're actually torqued together pretty tight. So what you want to do is get one of those little rod vise clamps, put it in there, and then just use a hand tool only to break it loose. You don't want to use a impact gun, because that'll strip up the threads potentially and cause damage later down the road for your engine. So just something to take note on. These rods are a 6.125, and these are a 4-inch stroke. The kit I have is a stroker kit from my 5.3 liter aluminum block engine, which comes out of the 2005 Silverados. And then I have, so these are by Compstar, which is also Cali's forged rods. And then I have Wiseco forged pistons with, I believe, I think it's about 5,000, or man, I can't remember. But there's a dish on the top, which is actually called a valve relief. Sometimes you'll have 4. This one has 2. And then so basically the other important thing to remember is that these have to match the valves on your heads, which the larger one for LS is intake, the smaller one's exhaust. This also has a small dot. The dot always needs to face to the front of the engine, so you can't just put this one on both sides, because the valve release need to point towards the lifter trays or the intake manifold, however you want to word that, but they cannot go in upside down like this. Okay, they need to go facing the lifter rails with the dot facing forward. So if you can look at this, the only way this is going to go in is going to be on the passenger side of the block, which would be the 2, 4, 6, or 8 cylinder. So you need to keep that into account. So you would want to lay this down, right? And then you need to look at your crankshaft and figure out which side does the chamfer need to be on. Is it going to be on the left side or the right side? Because after you get these in, these install to the rods with a wrist pin, which just looks like this. Just a really fine machine piece of tubing. And then you have what's called a spiral lock. The spiral lock comes like this, and you kind of just want to pull them apart, and it's just like basically like a spring. But after you put that rod in there with a wrist pin, you actually just feed this in, and it snaps in place, which keeps the pistons locked in there. So this will just go right here. So I can show you how to do all that stuff. But first, let me go ahead and get this stuff cleaned up. And I think that is the most important part about orientation. All right, one more thing I wanted to show you is the bottom of the head. So you can see that the intake and exhaust valves are actually starting with the intake valve on one side, and then the opposite side would start with the exhaust valve. So you got to keep that in account when you're doing the orientation, because you don't want it to be all mixed up. All right, so basically what you want to do is take your piston. First of all, you want to inspect the whole piston. Some pistons come with sharp edges, so you should look up how to deburr your pistons, get them all sanded down so there's no sharp edges. These are already pretty good. They actually already have like a CNC bevel on them. So now all I'm going to do is take some brake clean. Careful with your eyes. Make sure you're wearing glasses. Should kind of spray out all the rails, or the grooves, I guess you could say. This one's 386, 386. I'm just gonna wipe it down with a lint-free rag. Make sure there's no debris on there, no little metal filings or anything. Get it all cleaned out really nice. Inspect the little area where the the board where the wrist pins are gonna go. Get those all cleaned out. Okay. So this one looks pretty clean. All right, there you go. So there's our clean piston. We know from looking at this, this has to go on the passenger side. And then we know that on the passenger side, the heads need to start with the exhaust valve first. So basically now all I'm going to do is take my wrist pin. Clean this up too. Just keeping everything super clean. Clean, clean, clean. Okay. I already have the spiral lock installed on one side of the piston bore, which is this side. So you can see that spiral lock we talked about, which is already installed in there. And basically that'll stop the wrist pin from coming out. So that won't push through, but it will on this side. So what we're going to do is, before we actually finally install them all, we're going to take this piston and we're going to see which side the chamfer needs to be on. So we know it's going to be that way. We've got our rod, spray her out, clean it out. Make sure that little oil gallery is clear of any kind of debris. And then let's just take this and put it on like so. Slide the wrist pin in there. Also, at this point, you don't want to have your rings in there. Okay, so that's that. These pistons, if you look at them, are actually they're cut right here to make more room for the wrist pin to slide in, and basically they will come with these rail lock rings which overlap. These don't need to be filed or anything. One thing to note on these, there's a dot on these, and that dimple needs to point toward the bottom, and it needs to be 90 degrees to the wrist pin. So it would sit with the dot right here, and that keeps it from rotating on you. But that keeps it so your rings will not get caught up on there, and they can rotate and stuff and move freely. So that's one thing to note. But if you do put this on before you do the rods, you're not going to get that wrist pin in there because it's, you know, like 2,000 stick or whatever, and these are machined so perfectly. So now all we're going to do is take this piston with the rod temporarily installed, being careful not to drop it, and we're just going to slide it into the bore in the cylinder, and we're going to see if it works with that chamfer, or if there's any chamfer it'll work with. If it does, we're going to number it for that cylinder, and then we're going to move on to the next one. So let's do that now. Okay, so we got our piston. We know that dot always goes forward on the piston. And just by looking at our cylinder here, we're going to just place it in. Careful not to score or crank. Just kind of get it started in there. Okay, and then I'll go from the bottom here, and I will just kind of guide it so it doesn't score the journal on the crankshaft. Okay. And then that's sitting on there. You don't need the bearings on or anything for this. We're just checking it out. And then basically what you can do is look on there and see which side that journal is going to need the chamfer. Alright guys, so if you can see that, basically that rod comes in and connects to the journal on the left side of the crank, which means there's a radius on the left side. So we know we want our dot facing to the front of the engine, valve reliefs to the lifter trays, and then our chamfer on the big end of the rod going to the rear of the engine. So we can pull that back out now and mark it. All right, and just make sure you're careful when you pull them out because, once again, our wrist pin is not fully installed and they can just slide out super easy. So, okay, so we know that we want that dot to the front of the engine as if it were facing that side. Valve relief to the manifold. Okay, so that's how our piston's going to sit in the block. And we know now that we want our chamfer to be to the rear of the block. So now we can put our wrist pin in there with the correct orientation, like so. And that's how we want that one to go. Okay, so now what we're going to do is grab a latex glove. Right. I mean, you can actually wear latex gloves the whole time, but I get irritated with them. Alright, so we'll just get some assembly lube. Go ahead and put that on the small end of the rod. But be careful when you're doing latex gloves that you don't pinch off the fingertips inside there and forget it in there, because that could destroy your bearings. So now we'll get some more assembly lube. Put this on the wrist pin. Anything that's going to be contacting each other, you want to put assembly lube on. Not just motor oil, except for the piston walls. The cylinder wall, sorry. That's going to be motor oil. Alright, so there's that. And this is a Cleavite, or Cleavite, whatever, bearing assembly lube. They make a few different ones on the market. I think Lucas has a good one too. Alright, so we know the dot needs to always go to the front of the engine on the piston. We know our valve reliefs need to go toward the lifter tray side. So it needs to sit like this for the passenger side. And then last thing, our chamfer. We know it needs to go to the rear. So we'll take that big chamfer there and we will orientate that so it faces the rear of the engine, like so. Take our wrist pin, slide that in there. Bam, just like that. And then now we can go ahead and install our spiral lock. I'm just going to take this glove off so I can do this without having a glove on. So what you need to do for spiral locks, they make a fancy tool, but all you really need to do is get a small flat tip screwdriver and take your spiral lock out of the package. Just kind of separate it a little bit, like so. Alright, so you're just going to take that point of the spiral lock, which is, it looks like that, just like a little point at the end. And you're going to start that about the 5 o'clock position, and you're going to take a small flat tip screwdriver and just push it down till it locks in that groove. And then just walk it around the outside of the bore until you get the rest of it to lock in. And you're just going to continue that until you get to the last coil, and then you're going to pull up on the end of the spiral lock here to relieve tension on it, and then to just keep pushing it in there. So let's go ahead and try to do this real quick. And it was pretty hard the first time I did it, and then my dad taught me, like, he just kind of like broke it down and it made sense, and then I was able to do it pretty easily. So thank God for him. So all I'm doing is walking around, and it's snapping right in place like it should. Okay, and we're getting kind of binded up, so I'll take that tip of it and I'll kind of just pry up with my thumb a little bit and then continue to walk it around. Sorry, I need to be able to see this. So if you as you can see now, it wasn't going before, but when I pull up on it a little bit, it takes that tension off of the spring and it allows it to just pop in there like that. And then we're going to listen for a snap sound. You want to hear that snap sound so we know it's definitely locked in place. So listen. Alright. Did you guys hear that? It is locked in. We're just going to double check it with a screwdriver and kind of push it all in. Alright, and we are good. So our spiral lock is in there. Our piston rod is connected permanently. Well, I guess not permanently because you can take it back apart. To take it back apart, if you mess it up, all you do is take that little tip again, and you're just going to kind of pry it out. But instead of just trying to pry it out, you're going to want to pry it and then just keep pushing straight down and get the screwdriver under it, and then it'll come out. And then just be easy with it so you can reuse it. So that's that. Basically now we want to inspect our rod cap area and make sure that it's clean. That way we can put our bearing in there. So spray that with some brake clean. Get a fresh lint-free blue rag. We'll just clean that where there's no residue. Clean the chamfer side. That's good. And then we'll go ahead, do the same deal on our bearing. Okay. Just gently wipe the bearing so you don't scratch it or score it. Just don't want any debris on there. Make sure the tang side is the same. And then you just line that up and those pop in. And then it's important to make sure here that your bearing is actually centered and lined up, because if it's not, it's gonna cause rod knock. So make sure that's what that tang is for, to line up the bearing. It's not to hold it in, it's actually just to line it up. And then you just want to again give it a push on the edges to make sure they're flat. And push down in the center right here to make sure it's there. And basically what keeps these in is the crush from the rod caps and everything compressing against it. So now we will do the same thing for the rod cap. Just wipe it out really good. Wipe out the chamfer. Bam. Same thing with the bearing. Wipe her down. Okay. So we're nice and clean. And then we'll just match that tang up to line up our bearing. And then we will just pop her on in. Alright, so that's that part. For the bolts, you just want to make sure you inspect them. Make sure there's no metal shavings or anything on there, because that will ruin the threads. We don't want that. But before we go ahead and assemble this cap to our piston, I'll go through the rings real quick. And then I'll probably just make this one video so it's not too long. But basically this first ring is kind of a thicker ring, heavier duty material. It does overlap here. And then it has a dimple on it. I don't know if you could see that. It has a dimple. The dimple, point of the dimple, I guess you could say, the pointy part of the dimple needs to actually face down and 90 degrees to the wrist pin. So what we'll do is we'll basically just start it on there. Roughly where we need that to be. So right about there. And then we will just put the first part into the groove, like so. Kind of just hold it with our finger, and then just start wrapping it around, sliding it in with our thumb. Okay, so that kind of just spirals around. It pops in like that. So you can kind of put a little bit of pressure on those. Don't go too crazy because you don't want to twist them too bad that they don't compress anymore or something like that. So, and then I basically just take the area where there's like a small gap, and I take the tip of my screwdriver and I just slide it over until that dimple is directly in the center where that wrist pin is, and that should be facing down. And that just makes it so it doesn't rotate on you. And all you do now is it's good to have a brush here or some kind of oiler so you can just lightly lubricate these rings as you go. Alright, so that's the rail lock. Okay, so the next ring after that lock ring is going to be the expander ring. It looks like this. Very easy to move. Just be careful with it. Some of these will lock and overlap, and some will just butt together. So check yours. Mine just butt together, and all that for. So basically, the GM way to do it, they all have a certain ring orientation, so they all offset the other one's gap, if that makes sense. You don't want the gaps to be all lined up the same way because that will allow blow by. So what you need to do is look at the ones, the instructions that come with your specific pistons and rings, and orientate them like that. So I'm going to walk you through the Wiseco one for my setup. And basically, so we got our rail lock gap on this side. So I'm going to flip it over like so, and we want these to be pointing up. I believe it is. Yeah, pointing up. And we want those to meet at like the 6 o'clock position. So right above the Wiseco logo, basically. Once again, we're making sure they just butt up. Okay, so there's that. That just fits in that bottom groove there, right above that rail. Right above that little locking ring we put in there. Next one's going to be a oil ring, oil scraper ring, whatever you want to call it. And these don't get filed either. These have a slight gap to them. But double check once again with yours. For mine, it's going to be the about the 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock position for these. So we'll go, here's our 6 o'clock. And we'll start these. We'll start this one because it's going to be the bottom ring. The bottom ring goes on the 2 o'clock position. So we'll start it right there at like the 2 o'clock, right under the expander, but above that rail lock ring. And then we'll just kind of like follow it around with our thumb. Slide her in place. Pretty easy to do. You don't have to manhandle the crap out of it. Okay, so my expander ring is overlapping right now, which is not good. Alright, so that's in place, which hopefully takes tension off there. Okay, so now my expansion ring's back to normal. I do need to slide it over more though. There we go. So that's at the 6 o'clock. This is now at the 2 o'clock. And we can move on to the next one. Take this ring, which is the top oil ring. Okay, same exact ring. And we will just place it on top of the expander ring. And then that will be good to go as well. Alright, so that's how it should look now. Next up is going to be our compression rings. In order to figure out which one's which, read your sheet first. But for mine specifically, there is a dot on the top of the rings. And there's a bevel, like a chamfer, on the inside edge of the ring. So basically, if there's a dot and a chamfer on the same side, like this one, that's the top compression ring. I already showed you guys how to file these to fit. You can get a little ring filer tool, or you can just use like a filer and a vise and do it, but just make sure there's no burrs. Mine are all 19 thousandths ring gap on the top compression ring and 20 thousandths for the bottom. And this one right here has a dot on top, but it has a groove on the inside on the bottom of the ring. So we'll use that for the second groove ring. And for that, you're just going to use a little set of expansion pliers. These are like Harbor Freight. They do just fine. Okay, and so basically the second compression ring is going to be just behind that wrist pin, like that. Okay, so that's going to be just like that. I think this is sitting a little bit too low there. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing, but make sure our groove is toward the top and our dot is toward the top, so it's our top compression ring. Get our expansion pliers. You don't want to put too much pressure on these. Just be nice and easy with them. And then we will do the same deal, just enough to get it past the piston. And then drop that one in place as well. And of course I went too far down there. There you go. All right. Alright, so now we got top compression ring gap on this side, the other one on this side near the wrist pin, 2 oil ring gaps on 10 and 2, expansion ring at the 6 o'clock, and our lock rail with a dimple down 90 degrees to the wrist pin. So that's how you install your rings. All you would do now is take a either tapered sleeve compression tool or a compression tool like this from Harbor Freight, lubricate the inside, and then you will slide it in to the correct cylinder, and then go ahead and put your caps on and just hand tighten the bolts, and then you can go ahead and cinch those down and then go ahead and torque them to spec, which for me is 75 foot-pounds. So I think that about wraps up this video on how to assemble your pistons and your rods and your rod bearings. If you got any questions, shoot it down below, hit me up on Instagram. Happy to help anybody. And thank you guys so much for watching. Have a great day.